few weeks ago, I had the privilege of listening to Rabbi Feiner speak at my daughter's school, Malafa Malka dinner, and he talked about the importance of starting off a speech with a milsa de bedichusa, with a joke. And I couldn't think of a joke, and to me that was the biggest joke, because usually I have something funny to say, but tonight I couldn't. So instead, let me start off with a thought that I had. As Rabbi Feiner mentioned, Mishenichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha. Tonight is Rosh Chodesh Adar. A few weeks ago, I had the schus of standing by the Kaisel and davening. I took a trip to Eretz Yisrael. Standing by the Kaisel, I was struck by what the Kaisel is. Right? It's essentially a building. It's a wall left over from the Beis HaMikdash that represents, of course, the coming of Mashiach. As we know, the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt starting from the Kaisel. And on the one hand, it represents tremendous renewal, hope, new beginnings, the longing we all have for Mashiach. But of course, what it also represents is Chorban, because it's the last remaining piece of Chorban. And I was thinking about this dichotomy, Mishenichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha. We're gathered here to talk about Tsar. And I think perhaps the message is as follows. When people suffer, when people are in pain, when people sitting in Shiva, people are going through difficult times, it's not really a time to try to figure out what the purpose of the pain is. Pain is something that really destroys our cognitive abilities to think. So Mishenichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha, perhaps at a time of Simcha, in the context of Simcha, we can gather here tonight and talk a little bit about, perhaps, some ways of understanding and wrapping our heads around what pain is. Let me tell you a story. I like Hasidish Maislach, for those of you that know me. The Maggid of Mizrich, who was the Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, had a grandson who was known as the Rizhiner. Rabbi Yisrael of Rizhin was a very, very interesting tzaddik. He was somebody who lived with great opulence and wealth. And the story goes as follows. A chassid came to the Rizhiner and said, Rebbe, I'm an old man, I'm getting ready to die, making a cheshbon hanefesh, and I'm thinking about what my life was. And I was going through all the years, and I realized that I never really was very comfortable in life. I don't remember a day that went by that I was ever really fulfilled with food. I don't remember a winter that went by that I was warm. My wife suffered, my children suffered, and I realized that if I could sum up my life, I would say it was probably just filled with tzaras. And I'm making a cheshbon hanefesh. I'm going to come up to the Bezdin Shemala, I'm going to come up to Shemayim, and I'm thinking, what am I going to talk to Hashem about? And I realized I don't have any tainas on the Rabbeinu Shalom for the tzaras that I had. But I was thinking that, with all the tzaras that I had and all the difficulties that I had to spend a lot of time working, I had to spend a lot of time taking care of my family, and I didn't have enough time to do really much tzedakah, gemilas chasadim. I always wanted to learn a little bit, sit down with a nice warm coffee, maybe say some tehillim, and I never had time for that. And so I have a shtickle of a taina, I have a little bit of a complaint against the Rabbeinu Shalom, what's going to be with my life. I wanted to do such good things, but I couldn't because my life was just filled with tzaras. Every day I came home, and instead of davening or learning, I fell asleep. I krechtzt, I complained. Since that, I have a little bit of a taina on the Rabbeinu Shalom. Rebbe, please tell me, before I don't want to come up to Shemayim and Kaviyachol have a taina on the Rabbeinu Shalom, how do I wrap my head around this? And the Rizhiner, as those of us who might know the personality of the Rizhiner, he answered him with a very, very straightforward one line. What he said as follows. He said, my chassid, who told you what is more chavav in the eyes of the Rabbeinu Shalom? Your krechtzing, your pain, or your ma'asim tovim? Who told you that the Rabbeinu Shalom wanted you to sit and learn? Maybe the Rabbeinu Shalom wanted you to suffer. It's a hard story to think about. It's a hard answer to think about. And certainly I'm not going to talk about it hashkafically. But I think that there's something very, very important in what the Rizhiner is saying. Every single one of us has some kind of suffering, has some kind of pain. It's something Hashem gives us as an assignment. Some of us have small complaints. Some of us have really, really big complaints. So let's think about this for a minute. We call this tips and tools for turbulent times. Turbulence is confusion. And when I think of confusion, I think of being jolted out of my reality. Whatever I felt was certain somehow becomes not certain anymore. The ground shakes underneath me. I'm not really sure my expectations of life, things that I thought were real, perhaps turn out not to be real. The feelings of disappointment and overwhelm are constantly growing in our lives, whether it's here, in our community, in communities across the world, in Eretz Yisrael, of course. Some examples, some things that I see in my practice. People saying things like, I put my trust into someone, but I was sorely disappointed. I did business with somebody who was from, and as it turns out, well, he stole all my money and ran away. I thought that if I was good and I tried really hard, I'd be successful. I thought that only other people got cancer. I thought that only someone else's kid would get killed in Israel. I thought only somebody else would struggle with addictions. I didn't think my life would become confused with all of what's going on with internet pornography and other forms of sexual confusion. And yet somehow, way too many of us are living with these realities. But let's look at things on a little bit of a larger scale. I don't know how many people still listen to or watch the news. I can't watch it anymore. I mean, the news is just a magnet for negativity. Someone gets killed here, something happens over there. It's as if we've become addicted to pain somehow. Another shooting, another school massacre, another dictator somewhere has decided to kill out his entire country. Something that goes really underreported is anti-Semitism over campuses throughout the United States, through Europe. Of course, the stories that come out of Eretz Yisrael every day or every other day. I got a message about 3 hours ago that a mother in Lakewood was killed today in some kind of horrible car accident with the 3 little kids sitting in the car. I mean, these are realities. And I would love to tell you tonight how to conquer pain. I would love to announce that Mashiach is sitting right outside, of course, waiting for me to finish speaking. But Mashiach is sitting right outside. Pack your bags. Let's go. We're just going to go home. We're going to go to Eretz Yisrael. We're going to build the Beis HaMikdash. But I haven't gotten that WhatsApp message yet. So let's take a journey a little bit. Let's see if we could define pain. Let's see whether or not we can come up with some way of walking out of here with some kind of chizuk. So I want to tell you about a research study. It's not a research study. It's actually an entire body of research. It's called the negativity bias. What researchers have shown in the field of neuroscience, biology, psychology, is that the human brain reacts to negative emotions up to 5 times more intensely than the human brain reacts to positive emotions. Now think about this. We can all relate to this. So let's say I wake up in the morning and I start my day on time. I show up to shul on time. I come home. I have a positive interaction with my wife and kids. I get to work on time. I have a successful day. I remember to call my mother and do something nice. And I also manage to get one person upset at me. At the end of the day, what's going to stick out in my mind? That one person that I got upset at, that got upset at me. Because what the negativity bias essentially shows is that we have a propensity, naturally, biologically, we have a propensity to be affected more powerfully by negative things. With that in mind, of course, we recognize that developmentally, our goal is to learn how to overcome disappointments. Our goal in life is not to get bogged down by the negativity. Let me posit 3 things about pain. 3 facts, if you will. And this applies whether, again, we're talking about small things, big things, life-changing things, small, tiny little disappointments like stubbing your toe in the middle of the night. But let's say this. Number 1, let's define what pain is. If you think about what physical pain is, Pain is an indicator. In fact, it's actually a gift. It's like a sign. It says there's something not right. Something's not right. Something doesn't feel right. It's a gift. It's a matana from Hashem that shows us there's something not right. And the same thing is true with emotional pain. If I have any kind of emotional pain, again, it's a siman from Shemayim that there's something not right. So that's number one. Number two, like I said before, pain is something that every single human being has. Whether it's a big scale or not a big scale, pain is something, it's an assign from Hashem, it's something that's a fact of life. And the third fact that I want to really focus on is that there are two basically different kinds of pain that people go through. There is pain that is inflicted by internal things, whether it's depression, whether it's weight, whether it's anxiety, whether it's an addiction. But pain, of course, is also something that can be inflicted on us. It's a very, very sad reality. In the 10 years that I'm a therapist, I can't tell you how many different stories of sexual molestation, of divorce, men and women struggling with things like homosexuality, addictions. There are lists of addictions that keep growing by the day. The effects of technology. I'm not talking about pornography. I'm simply talking about how people get lost and intimacy kind of goes out the window with technology. So there are two different kind of pains. There are pains that take place because of things that we struggle with personally, and there are pains that are, of course, inflicted on us. So those are three facts. Those are three basic facts about pain. Again, number one, pain is an indicator that something's not right. Number two, pain is something that every single one of us has. And number three, there are two different sources of pain. There are internal sources of pain and external sources of pain. But now this is where things get complex. Because while all that is true, we, of course, as human beings, react to pain. And in our reactions to pain, I would say that there are two basic kinds of reactions to pain. There are people who suffer, and there are people who grieve. And let me tell you what the difference in my mind is. The difference between suffering and grieving is as follows. People who suffer get stuck in their pain. They get stuck feeling pain, they don't grow, they don't move on, they don't accept new realities, and essentially they end up with a cycle of pain. That's people who suffer. And again, I'm using that terminology, suffer, to describe that kind of reaction. And of course, there are people who grieve. And grieving, as we'll talk about in a minute, is the opposite. Grieving allows us to deal with pain. It allows us to see what's being indicated. As I said before, pain is a gift. It's an indicator. So let's talk for a minute about suffering. People who suffer essentially believe that they can't deal with whatever's causing them pain. And in fact, we can all relate to some of these things that I'm going to say. For example, how many of us can relate to eating when we feel bored? Maybe I'm the only one. But I could say this. Boredom is a kind of anxiety. It's something discomforting. It's a source of pain. When we eat, when we're bored, we're essentially suffering. Because what we're saying is I'm not facing my pain. I'm going to distract myself. I'm going to do something different. How many of us can relate to working too hard when we're anxious, or keeping ourselves really, really busy and distracting ourselves when we're sad? Again, that is a form of suffering, because what suffering essentially says is I can't deal with pain. But there's something a lot worse about suffering. There's something a lot worse about people who can't handle pain. When people think that pain is an indicator that they're not good. And this, to me, is probably the number one thing that I see in my office on a consistent hourly basis. When people assume that because there's some kind of disappointment in their life or there's some kind of pain, it means that they're not good, that the Ribono Shel Olam hates them, that essentially they're just evil people, and that's the reason why they have pain. Of course, we're talking about shame. That's the word that defines this. Shame is an epidemic. It is probably the biggest epidemic that the world suffers from today. a lack of sense of self, a lack of joy, a lack of interest in life, because essentially life gets too hard, I can't deal with it, and I shut down. Like I said before, but almost on an hourly basis, shame is probably the greatest thing that I treat. And in fact, the jokes, they make lots of jokes about psychologists and mental health people. One joke comes to mind right away. Forgive me, it's a joke about a bar, but I'll tell you very quickly. I guess I did have a joke. A guy walks into a bar and he orders a beer. Not that I know what a bar is, but in bars they have beer, and there's a bartender, and the guy gives him a bottle of beer, and the guy drinks half the bottle of beer, and he throws the other half back in the bartender's face. So the bartender goes, well, what are you doing? So he says, listen, I'm really, really sorry. It's been 30 years since I've been in a bar. I have this problem, and I don't really know much about it. I thought after 30 years I'd be over this problem. I don't get it. I'm really, really sorry. So the bartender realizes that this guy is, this is like a really difficult existential crisis for him. So he pulls out a business card and he gives it to the guy and he says, listen, my brother's a psychologist. Go see him. He'll help you. You don't have to walk around with so much shame and negativity in your whole life. Go get fixed. Go get help. And come back when you're finished, and I'll give you a free beer, and you'll see it's not the end of the world. 6 months later, the door to the bar comes flying open, and this guy walks in like he owns the place, and he turns to the bartender and he says, I want drinks on everybody. Your brother's a genius. The psychologist, he's a genius. So the bartender says, wow, that's great. And he gives him a bottle of beer, and the guy drinks half the bottle of beer, and what do you think he does? He throws the other half back in the bartender's face. So the bartender says, wait 1 second. 6 months later, you went to the psychologist. He said everything is fine, everything's great, but you threw the bottle of beer back at me. So the guy says, no, you don't understand. I went to your brother. He helped me. I don't feel bad about it anymore. It's great. I'm cured. It's a joke, but the reality is most of what people suffer with when they come to therapy, it's not that people have crises in life that are very different than the rest of us. It's that they don't know how to deal with it. They suffer. They get stuck in this thing called shame. It's the most toxic thing. It's the biggest epidemic, in my opinion, in the world of mental health. So that's suffering. Let's talk for a minute about grieving, of course, as the other reaction to pain. Somebody who grieves, obviously, is able to say that I recognize that there are disappointments in my life. I recognize that, like I said, the Rebbeinu Shalom gives an nisyonos, and it's okay that I'm in pain. It's okay means that I recognize that the pain is going to take me somewhere. And if I allow myself time, I will heal, I will grow. If I spend time alone, if I spend time with a confidant, if I lean on somebody's shoulder, if I'm able to cry. To me, one of the most psychologically poignant halachas that we have are the halachas of Avelis. Without going into anything, again, hashkafically, I'll just say this. All of the halachas of Avelis mimic what modern psychology has shown to be the stages of grief. First, you have a stage called aninus, then you have shiva, then you have a month, then you have a year, and then you have a yahrzeit. I had a couple who came to me once. Their fairly young teenager had overdosed on drugs. They came to me a few weeks after the child's death, and I sent them away, and I said, you're sitting at a time now where you're going to be in pain. And there's nothing, I could listen to you, but you have each other, and you have family. You don't need to be in therapy now. Come back to me in a year if you can't budge and you can't move. And kachava, they did. They came back to me a year later, and the message that they had learned after walking out of therapy was they can't bring their son back. And the hole that's in their heart is not going anywhere. But they don't have to have their lives stopped because of it. That is what grieving looks like. People who grieve need healthy outlets. When somebody has some kind of pain inflicted on them, they need to find something that they can engage in. Not something to distract themselves, but something they can engage in. When we grieve, we need to give ourselves time. We need to find what our limitations are. We need to recognize, like I said, that pain is a normal part of life. And of course, people who grieve, or when we grieve without shame. We live in a society today, of course, especially in the frum world, that's really hard to cry in public. But crying is a natural, normal sense of grieving. And let me share with you one more idea about grieving, about clarity. Because like I said before, when people have pain, there are two kinds of sources of pain. There are things that happen to us that are inflicted on us by other people. And then, of course, there are things that we struggle with in our own selves that cause us disappointment. But if I can, I would like to make a paradigm shift. I would like for a minute for us to stop thinking about whether or not pain is caused by other people or pain is caused by ourselves, and make the paradigm shift to the following. What are things in my life that cause me pain that I need to learn to accept? And what are things that happen to me in life that I need to learn to change? Taking responsibility for myself and stopping to blame myself or other people. You know, one of the words, I tell this to a lot of my clients, one of the words that I wish could be eradicated from the English language is the word fault. F-A-U-L-T. See, I could spell. Fault. I don't know what the word fault means, other than to say, you did something wrong, or I did something wrong. I'm not really sure what that means. The question is not who's at fault. The question is who needs to take what responsibility. When we can take responsibility for ourselves, then we can grow. When we can learn to accept, like that story I shared with you of those parents, when we can learn to accept the changes in reality, then we have successfully grieved. It's one of my favorite secular prayers that's been made famous by the World of 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, is the Serenity Prayer. I think about it all the time, and it goes like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Those three things are probably one of the biggest keys to life. The serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and of course, the wisdom to be able to tell the difference between the two. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. It's found in the writings of Rabbi Nachman in different ways. It's found in the Tanya. It's found in Maral, etc., etc. To have this kind of clarity is something that's really, really important. But again, what I would say is, the people that come to see me, the people that really honor me by trusting me to help them, for the most part, they walk out of my office learning how to grieve. And for the most part, they know how to grieve on their own, but they have to learn how to stop suffering. And so there are many, many things we have in our Messiah about suffering and about pain. They're all different philosophical ideas. They're all different kinds of spiritual ideas. Bad things happen to me because Hashem wants to hear my tefillas. Hashem wants me to change something in my life. Hashem wants to punish me. Hashem wants me to find silver linings in things. What doesn't kill you make you stronger. But the essential thing that I think we need to know before we get to any of those philosophical ideas is Hashem sends painful things to us. And Hashem recognizes, as we said in the halachas of Avelos, Hashem recognizes the nature of man, that we need time when we're in pain. So let's talk a little bit more practically, if we can. One of my favorite Carlebach songs, which of course is popularized, after he died, are to the words in Amos. I go like this: Hine yamim ba'im nu'um Hashem. Their days are coming. Ve'ishlachti ra'av ba'aretz. And Hashem says, and I sent ra'av, hunger, or really means longing. Lo ra'av lalechem. We're not longing. People will not be longing for bread. V'lo tzama lamayim. They won't be thirsty for water. Kiyam l'shmo es devar Hashem. But to hear the word of Hashem. After working with so many people in pain, I had the following thought. Hishlachti ra'av ba'aretz. Hashem said there's going to be a longing, there's going to be some painful hunger that exists in the world. The pain and the hunger that exists in the world today is infinite. It's the kind of thing that us in the field of mental health, the organizations that are represented here tonight, can say, everybody is overwhelmed by it. The only thing that I can think of when I think of how infinite the amount of longing and pain there is in the world is to think about the only other thing that I know what infinity is, and that's Hashem. If I can have any hasaga about what infinity means, about what Ein Sof means, I think about the amount of tsaros that Klal Yisrael suffers through. So of course, practically, for us to learn how to turn to and daven to Hashem in whatever language we can that would make it the most personal, of course, is the first practical step in terms of how we deal with pain. September 13th, 2001, I found myself on a train driving into Manhattan with my father and recognizing and seeing from the Brooklyn Bridge how the entire skyline was dark. And even though everything was pitch black, you can still see the billows of smoke coming out of what used to be the World Trade Center. I'd spent 2 days prior to that glued to, I was going to say the television, but of course, I wouldn't, to the television, and sitting in my house in Flatbush and watching the soot fall down in our backyard, miles and miles away. On the train going into Manhattan with my father to spend the night volunteering for the Red Cross. And of course, we showed up there and they put us at a table with a big cross behind us, and I had this question, but then I forgot about it. And I spent the night giving out apples and towels. There was a rabbi who came and he dropped off a Tehillim. 10 minutes later, a different rabbi came, picked up the Tehillim. And I remember crying. And I really just remember crying. There was a guy that had on the back of his sweatshirt, it said City Morgue. And he said that he was one of the drivers for the City Morgue. He asked me if he can turn around on the side, and he vomited on the floor. He said he had never seen such carnage. But that night left a very, very important imprint on me, because going to ground zero and being involved was something that was so cathartic, because I had a place to cry. I had a place to try to wrap my head around the carnage and the evil of what was going on in the world. I can't think of something that's more helpful than to be able to be involved in something. I didn't catch the number of how many non-for-profits there are here, but I can guarantee you that at least for most of them, if any of us want to call up and volunteer, there's work to be done. Get involved, do something. It's nice to write a check, of course. Every organization needs money. But get involved. If you have suffered through something, if you have some kind of pain in your life, do something with it. Get involved. Ask how you can help. And finally, as a practical piece of advice, is another Hasidic Maisa. Chassid came to Yitzchak Mevorka, threw himself down on the floor and said as follows, Rebbe, my 12-year-old daughter is laying in her deathbed. The doctors have written her off and said she's finished. She's going to die. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I simply am at a loss for words, and crying and crying. And the Rebbe looked at his chassid and said to him, listen, I'm sorry. The gates of Shemayim are closed. There's nothing we can do. There's just nothing you can do. Finished. Koilei Suvrakim, the chassid screamed and he cried and he pleaded, and he was manad of money, all kinds of things to try to get Rabbi Yitzchak Mevorka to daven, and Rabbi Yitzchak Mevorka said, I'm sorry, the gates of Shemayim are closed, there's nothing to do. Gave him a bracha and the chassid left. 10 minutes later, as the chassid's driving in his carriage down the road, he hears somebody calling his name, and he turns around, opens up the door to his carriage, and he sees Rabbi Yitzchak Mevorka is running after him, chasing, sweating, and he says, wait, wait. Rabbi Yitzchak Mevorka is calling out to his chassid, wait, wait. So the chassid stops and he says, Rebbe, what do you want? What? So Rabbi Yitzchak Mavorka gets into his carriage and he says to him, you came to me and you asked me to daven, and I said to you I couldn't daven. As you were crying to me, I was thinking whether or not if there's a way to have some kind of Yeshua, and I couldn't find a way to have Yeshua. You promised me money. You promised you would change all your negative traits. But Lamaisa, at the end of the day, there was nothing to do. I gave you a bracha and you left. But you know something? There's one thing I didn't do. I didn't cry with you. Can you give me a few minutes to just cry with you? There is something so powerful about being able to be there for each other. Rabbi Feiner talked about achdus. It's time we develop sensitivity to the pains of what other people go through. So many of us tend to go through obstacles and cry alone. Not sharing it with our spouses, not sharing it with our siblings, with our parents, with our friends. For every patient that comes into my office and says to me something like, I think I'm the only person in the world that, fill in the blank. Whatever it is, I'm the only person in the world that suffers from anxiety. I'm the only person in the world that's ever been sexually molested. I'm the only person in the world that's ever, fill in the blank. I've seen at least 5 more people in the world like that. And sometimes I feel like I need to just open up a support group and walk around and say, listen, you know, you and you should all know that you're all suffering from the same thing, and you all think that nobody else is suffering from that. How can we develop a certain sensitivity to each other's pain? Because we all have it. I promised my wife I wouldn't sing, so I won't sing. But here are the words. The A.B. Rottenberg's Who Am I? Have you known the pain of sadness and the feelings that it brings? Yes, I'm sure there have been some times you've had to cry. And the loneliness is worst of all. I'm sure you will agree, for we are not so different, you and I. Yes, we live in a society where we all try to put our best foot forward. We all try to not be judgmental. We all try to figure out how to not be judgmental with each other, but that's a hard time we have. But Lamaisa, we are not so different. None of us are so different. All of our blood is red. All of us cry tears. All of us have some kind of disappointment in our life. How can we develop sensitivity to each other? I want to conclude with a little exercise. I want each and every one of us to take a minute and think about the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. Whether it's a person, whether it's a scenic view, the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And when you have that thought, I want you to think of something else. Think of the thing you value or cherish the most. I want you to think of those 2 things for a minute. The most beautiful thing you've ever seen and the thing that you cherish and value the most. And when you have that thought, I want to tell you a word. I heard this many, many years ago, and it left a really strong imprint on me. The pasuk in Tehillim says, we say this in the morning, the pasuk says, Haroife l'shvurei leiv u'mechabesh la'atzvosam. Hashem, who's called the healer of broken hearts, and the one who ties together the hearts of those who are depressed. That's one pasuk. And the next pasuk says, Mona misper la'kechavim. Hashem is the one who counts the amount of stars there are. U'lechulam shemas yikran. And he gives them names. And so the question is asked, what is the connection between these 2 psukim? They exist right next to each other. What is the connection between Hashem counting the amount of stars there are and giving each one of the stars names, and Hashem being a rofei l'shvurei leiv, a healer of broken hearts? My father's chavrusa answered as follows. He said like this, do you want to know how Hashem heals broken hearts? We know that Avram was told by Hashem that your children will be as numerous as the amount of stars there are in the sky. And not just does Hashem count the billions of stars that exist, but he calls each one by name. When a Jew feels what it's like to be the most valued and cherished creature of all of creation, when a Jew feels that when Hashem looks at him, he's the most beautiful sight that's ever been seen in Hashem's eyes, Haroifel l'shvirei lev. That's how Hashem heals broken hearts. Because no matter how much pain and no matter how much suffering that exists in the world, the beauty of who we are is infinitely greater than any of the negativity that we might suffer through, any of the negativity of the failures, the disappointments. That's how Hashem looks at us. Before we even talk about Torah and mitzvahs, every single one of us has a neshama. And a neshama is a piece of Hashem. And when Hashem looks down on the earth and he sees the Grand Canyon and he sees the Rockies and he sees sunsets and he sees all those things, he marvels at it, of course. But when he looks down at a Jew, he sees something that's 10 times more awesome. I talked a little bit about this thing called the negativity bias, that we all have this propensity to be able to be impacted 5 times more about negative things. But let me tell you something I heard from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. In an address to students of a somewhat secular seminary in Eretz Yisrael, he said as follows. He said that morning he was walking down the street in Rehavia somewhere. It was before Vasikin and it was pitch black, and he was marveling at how free he felt to be in a country where nobody would recognize him and nobody would talk to him. And of course, a little old Jew, he says, a French Jew comes up to him, and he says to him, Rabbi, I have a question for you. He says, yes. He says, how could it be that we have taken the most beautiful religion in the world and turned it into the most ugly thing? Judgments, negativity, shame. How could it be? So Rabbi Sachs, addressing this crowd, he says as follows. He says, I said to the man, it's Taka, a good question. I want to think about it. He says, but based on that question, I want to offer a challenge to every single one of you seminary students. If you have had one fragment of beauty in your experience here in Israel, if you have tasted one good thing about Judaism, if you've had one good deep conversation or there's been one lesson that you've learned, take that message back with you to whatever community you come from. Take that message to your family, take that message to your friends, and build your life around that. Cling hold, he says, cling hold to the fragmented beauty, because this religion is a religion bigger, greater, and more lovely than we have sometimes allowed it to be. And that's the perspective of Yiddishkeit. That's what Hashem wants. Yes, of course, there's pain and suffering. But the simcha, mishenichnas adam marbim besimcha, the simcha of what it feels like to be the most cherished and most beautiful creature of how Hashem looks at us, is a simcha that never gets touched by the pain, no matter how difficult it is. And if we could tap into that, then maybe Hashem will listen to our tefillas and piece by piece bring us back to the kaisel, build the bricks of our broken hearts. We should be zoicha to dance this Purim with Mashiach and the Beis HaMikdash b'mehera b'yameinu.